Welcome. Hi, I'm Chris Higgins. I am the chair of the Miller Programs Committee, and I'm here to welcome you to the second MillerComm lecture of the year. Our first, maybe ever, in Krannert, Masumi. I don't know. We're usually in the Spurlock. It's nice to be in a new... Okay, we've been here. Yeah. But it's still nice to be back and to welcome you here. We're a little old-fashioned. We have this funny tradition where I stand up here and I tell you a little about MillerComm and about the man whose name the MillerComm lecture series bears. And the problem is, like, I see at least 10 people who were here last night for the Prashad over at Spurlock, and I don't know how fast I can rotate my material. Like, there's a limited number of George A. Miller jokes. I'm not Louis C.K., so I have to, I have this, but it already feels stale, and I don't know. That's my shtick. There it is, meta humor. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about MillerComm and about George Miller. So the lecture series is all about bringing people to campus, scholars, creative artists, public intellectuals who speak across disciplines. And that's really important, whose work can attract a broad audience. And George Miller was an interesting guy. He was a fairly well-known mathematician of his time. He taught at Michigan, Cornell, Stanford. Then he came here. He's known for his work in something called the theory of finite groups. There's a joke coming later, exactly one, so get ready for it. He received the International Mathematics Prize in 1900 and was president of the Mathematical Association of America in 1921. But for all of that, he was a very unassuming figure. One of the things he did toward his later years was he took his meals, as they say, in the company of undergrads in the Illini Union. And he was a very thrifty man. See the aforementioned theory of finite groups? Yeah, there was my joke. Okay. And quietly amassed a fortune of $1 million. And he left the whole thing to the university, remarking, "Everything I have received from the university, and I simply want to repay my obligation." So I just wanted to say thanks to George and welcome to you all to tonight's lecture. And here's Allison to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks very much, Chris. I'm Allison Purpura, and I'm Senior Curator and Curator of Global African Art here at Krannert Art Museum. And I really want to thank all of you for coming. This is really very terrific. I know we're all very eager to set sail with Isabel's 5 objects, but I do want to begin by thanking our many generous co-sponsors of the event. Those include, of course, the Center for Advanced Studies, the Illinois Program and Research for the Humanities, the Center for Global Studies, Asian American Studies, Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, Center for African Studies, the Department of History, English, Comparative and World Literatures, and Anthropology, the School of Art and Design, International and Area Studies, and Libraries, and KCPA. Thank you all very much. And a special shout out thanks to Antoinette Burton and to Nancy Castro for co-organizing tomorrow's IPRH seminar, which will feature Isabel Hofmeyr's work. It is my exquisite pleasure to welcome Professor Isabel Hofmeyr to Krannert Art Museum. An internationally recognized scholar and public intellectual, Dr. Hofmeyr is Professor of African Literature at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, and visiting Global Distinguished Professor of English at NYU. She was also Acting Director of the Center for Indian Studies in Africa, University of the Witwatersrand, to which she also helped to create. Dr. Hofmeyr is a scholar of extraordinary breadth and rigor. She has broken new ground in the study of global intellectual histories with her work on the critical study of literacy and oral literature, the transnational circulation of print cultures and texts, and on the movements of people between the Indian subcontinent and Southern Africa. She was among the first to recognize the Indian Ocean as an important analytic site for grappling with post-national, post-area studies and global forms of cultural production. She has shown us that the Indian Ocean is at once a theoretical terrain, a geographical space, and a historical network of human connectivity. One of Dr. Hofmeyr's significant and lasting contributions has been to foreground the place of Africa in imperial and oceanic frames, to draw out the implications of Indian Ocean studies has for African scholars in Africa and the African diaspora, and to provide a critical genealogy of why Africa has in fact been all but erased from global studies in the Indian Ocean world. Highlights from Dr. Hofmeyr's extensive accolades and publications include We Spend Our Years as a Tale That Is Told, Oral Historical Narrative in a Southern African Chiefdom, 1994. The Portable Bunyan, A Transnational History of the Pilgrim's Progress, 2004. And Gandhi's Printing Press, Experiment in Slow Reading, 2013. She has also authored numerous articles, book chapters, and co-edited volumes, including one with our very own Antoinette Burton called 10 Books That Shaped the British Empire, Creating an Imperial Commons. Dr. Hofmeyr's wide-ranging work on Africa and the Indian Ocean has deep resonance with CAM's exhibition, with the CAM exhibition that actually inspired this invitation. World on the Horizon, Swahili Arts Across the Indian Ocean, which opened just last week, reveals that Swahili arts are marked by multiple histories and aesthetic trends that are themselves itinerant and subject to divergent claims and interpretations. As such, they prompt us to undisciplined art historical canons and museological frameworks that have long kept Africa, Asia, and Europe apart and in place. Dr. Hofmeyr's work advances our explorations of these unmoored objects and the new ways of knowing that they make possible. So please join me in welcoming Isabel Hofmeyr.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison, for that wonderful introduction. It is really such a great pleasure and an honor to be here to deliver this lecture, but more importantly, to be associated with this exquisite and extraordinary exhibition, World on the Horizon. And if you haven't seen it, it really is a quite remarkable, as you'll see, a remarkable kind of collection of objects from all over the world. My thanks also to Antoinette Burton, to Alison and to Britta Meyer for this invitation, and it's a really great pleasure to be here. Okay, so let's get going, and let's begin with one of the great books of the Indian Ocean, Abdul Razak Gurnah's novel By the Sea. Okay. The narrative opens in Zanzibar and traces the story of two families feuding over property. The feud is set in motion when a dashing Persian merchant from Bahrain arrives in the monsoon season and seduces the young son of one of the families, while ensnaring the other in a complicated loan using the house of the first family as collateral. So a complicated plot. Also important is a beautiful ebony table which the Persian trader buys as a gift for the young boy he is seducing, and which he purchases with cash and a £20 packet of rare incense from Bangkok. There is, of course, much more in the novel, but I think for our purposes this evening, what is important is that the plot is set in motion from the ocean. The arrival of the Persian trader by sea precipitates the storyline. It is hence a story that comes from the sea. Also important are the objects that arrive from across the ocean, the ebony table, possibly from Ceylon or Makassar, and the incense from Bangkok. The novel is a tale of the seductive and at times destructive power of the stories and objects that come from far away, from across the ocean, or as the title suggests, by the sea, i.e. by means of the sea. Now I start with these themes since they resonate with this exhibition World on the Horizon, which is concerned with objects in the sea, or as the advertising material indicates, the affective power of objects to create networks of affinity across different cultures. As Britta Meyer says in her book, Swahili Port Cities, The Architecture of Elsewhere, and I quote, "Exotic objects fulfilled a desire to possess and amass the materiality of far away. These objects paid tribute to mobility and the ability to make the exotic one's own." She calls these objects relational loci. So objects, they configured different cultural traditions, and such objects could, as she said, they could not be traced back to one place or one society. The Swahili coast asks us to reconsider where Africa, Asia, and Europe begin and end. Now, my talk this evening is intended as a very broad orientation for this remarkable and exquisite exhibition. and I'll attempt to take some of its concerns and explore these in order to give you some sense of the big themes of Indian Ocean history. So what I'm going to do is begin with a shortish section really of Indian Ocean 101 to give you some very basic background, and I hope it's not too basic. And then I'll explore these themes through our 5 objects for this evening: a style of cloth, a shrine, a ship, a book, and a jellyfish. Okay, so let's begin then with our 101 section, and we begin with a figure who will be familiar to all of you, Mark Twain, who in 1896 undertook a world trip. In April of that year, he traveled by steamship, or ocean greyhound as he called them, from Calcutta to Mauritius, which is Mauritius just being to the right of Madagascar. And in his diary he noted, "We are upon the smooth waters of the Indian Ocean, nothing in sight from horizon to horizon, a cooling breeze. There is no mail to read and answer, no newspapers, no telegrams. If I had my way, I would sail on forever and never go to live on the solid ground again." Now, there is much that one could say about Twain's Indian Ocean travels, but what concerns us this evening is one rather circumstantial detail, namely the cooling breeze that he mentions. Now, while the movement of the steamer would have generated something of a breeze, a vessel traveling southeast at that time of year, April, would have been heading into the monsoon winds, just beginning to blow quietly from the southwest before picking up in intensity a few weeks later. Then 6 to 8 months later, the winds would reverse direction and blow the other way around. Now, the seasonal regime of winds is one of the paramount environmental factors of the Indian Ocean world. The word itself comes from the Arabic, mawsim, meaning season, and the system arises from the fact that the Indian Ocean has a kind of ceiling, i.e. its northern edge is blocked by a massive continental landmass. Land and water deal with heat in different ways, producing patterns of high and low pressure and consequently of wind as well as of rain. So as Edward Elpers indicates in his book, and I quote, "From November through January, pressure builds up over continental Asia and blows dry winds from Arabia and Western India towards Eastern Africa and from China towards Southeast Asia. From April to August, this process is reversed as high pressure zones in the southern hemisphere push strong winds towards the north." Now, the seasonal regime has shaped the rhythm of life around the ocean for millennia, bringing rain to farmers, blowing dhows across the ocean, and enabling trade between the different ecological zones of the Indian Ocean arena. Now, so this monsoon makes the Indian Ocean basin a benign environment for long-distance voyaging, unlike the Atlantic, which is difficult to cross both ways by sail, given that the prevailing winds blow in one direction throughout the year. The Indian Ocean is hence the world's oldest long-distance transoceanic trading arena, which has been crossed for millennia, and it's sometimes known as the cradle of globalization. There is, of course, much of the Indian Ocean that falls outside the monsoon-created world, the monsoon-created region, which you see there as more, as the pink bit. But as we'll see later, the influence of this monsoon-created world reaches well beyond its borders. Now, given that these long millennia of trade and exchange, one key concern of Indian Ocean studies has been a focus on cultural interaction and cosmopolitanism. Port cities around the littoral of the ocean have sustained deep forms of material, intellectual, and cultural exchange, so that denizens of these ports often had more in common with each other than with their fellows inland. This early cosmopolitan world has famously been explored in Amitav Ghosh's In an Antique Land, which contrasts the rigidity of borders in the 1980s when the book was written with the relative ease of movement in the late medieval Indian Ocean world. a theme explored through the travels of Abram bin Yiju, a 12th century Jewish Tunisian merchant, also a calligrapher and a poet, based in Cairo and then in India. Now, central to these histories of mobility and exchange in the Indian Ocean has been the spread of Islam across land and sea from the 7th century of the Common Era. These religious networks extended and energized the already existing long-distance trading interactions, providing an enabling framework in terms of commerce, shared legal, educational, and spiritual structures, as well as the centrifugal power of the Hajj. By the 14th century, mercantile networks were almost entirely in the hands of Muslim traders. In their wake came scholars, theologians, Sufi divine, Sufism, the mystical version of Islam, being an extremely important strand in Indian Ocean history, and there are traces of Sufism in the exhibition, as you'll see. So Islam in the Indian Ocean arena came to constitute, quote, the largest cultural continuum in the world, as Abdul Sharif has argued in his book on the Indian Ocean. When the Portuguese rounded the Cape in the 15th century, they entered what many have termed a Muslim lake, dominated in the north by the Turkish Ottoman, the Persian Safavid, and the Indian Mughal empires. When the Dutch arrived in the Indian Ocean a bit later, they were able to go from one end of it to another by carrying letters of introduction from Muslim sultans on various shores. Now, as the scholar Eng Seng Ho has indicated, these sprawling networks of Muslim commerce were transacted without the backing of an army or a state. And I quote from him. He says, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English in the Indian Ocean were strange new traders who brought their states with them. They created militarized trading post empires in the Indian Ocean, following Venetian and Genoese precedents in the Mediterranean, and were wont to do business at the point of a gun. While early European entrants to the Indian Ocean world had initially to accommodate themselves to the trading orders that they encountered, by the 19th century, European empires dominated the Indian Ocean arena. With their military, transport, and communication infrastructure, these empires intensified the movement of people across the Indian Ocean world. Much of this mobility was forced and conscripted and involved slaves, indentured laborers, political exiles, and prisoners who were transported between different regions of the Indian Ocean world. At times, these systems built on existing foundations of labor exploitation. So, as some recent research indicates, South Asian indentured laborers, of whom we'll hear a bit more later, were often taken from regions in India where slavery had long existed. So then old and new systems of unfree labor articulated to produce what some have called a carceral archipelago of prisons, plantations, and penal colonies. Now, an archive of such depth and density going back millennia, the Indian Ocean has become an important site for relativizing European-dominated accounts of world history. In such a schema, the age of European empires is but one tiny little sliver in a much bigger arc of history. A view from the Indian Ocean also unsettles notions of European colonizers as purveyors of global grand schemes, as opposed to colonized groups who are often seen as local or parochial. The encounters between Indian Ocean societies and European imperialisms were not simply a case of a globalizing colonizer versus a provincial colonized. Instead, as historians like Eng Seng Ho and Shugata Bose have indicated, the Indian Ocean became an arena of competing universalistic claims. The ambition of British imperialism, for example, were countered by the equally grand visions of Islam. The ancient diffusionism of Hinduism and Buddhism from India into East and Southeast Asia was held up as a benign mode of imperialism that showed up the shortcomings of European colonialism. Indeed, the Indian Ocean arena has produced a very rich repertoire of transoceanic ideologies, be it pan-Islam, Hindu reformism, or pan-Buddhism. Such ideologies inevitably came to carry an anti-imperial inflection, which subsequently fed into ideas of Afro-Asian solidarity and non-alignment arising out of the Bandung Conference in 1955, at which 29 newly independent nations gathered to forge a new path rather than falling in line with either of the rival camps in the emerging Cold War. Yeah. So these long centuries of interaction produced cultural forms of great complexity and layering, and this is the exhibition really captures this wonderfully. There was a multi-directional fusion of religious, intellectual, and political styles, currents, and genres. So let's turn then to our 5 objects to explore these layered interactions in more detail. Okay, and we'll begin now with some fabric, okay, which you see in this image of a festive occasion in the very far north of South Africa, with women decked out in their dancing gear. Now, of particular interest to us this evening are their skirts. These are known as shibelani and are made up of some 50 yards of material which is strung on a cord and then gathered and pleated to produce a kind of swirling effect. For the past 2 centuries and still today, the fabric has been known as selampur and retails under that name still today. So here you can see this fabric being sold as Shangaan selampur, Shangaan being one of the terms for one of the ethnic groups up in the north of South Africa. Now this name selampur originally came from fabric produced on the Coromandel coast of India, and it was exported to the West Indies where it was used for slave clothing. In Southern Africa, however, the term is widely believed to be a Portuguese word. It's believed to be of Portuguese origin. So when I first began preparing this talk, I jumped to the conclusion that this combination of this cloth plus the Portuguese link pointed to a well-known Indian Ocean trade route linking Mozambique, as you can see, up to Gujarat, around Cambay and Surat. And it was a transoceanic exchange, largely of African ivory for Gujarati cloth. Okay, and it's been wonderfully studied in Pedro Machado's work, and he's outlined this trade and explained how Gujarati merchants established themselves in the Mozambique region from the 18th century, and they built up a trade where the design of cloth was driven by African consumer tastes. And each season, brokers from Mozambique would kind of pick up the desired color and style and take that information back to weavers in Gujarat, who would produce the cloth, which then came back. However, when I thought about it more carefully, I realized that some pieces didn't quite fit into this picture. And I wondered how exactly did cloth then from the Coromandel coast make its way to Mozambique? So to sort this out, I wrote to Pedro, who kindly explained matters and sketched out a much more complex and interesting picture. So I think the first part of this picture involved the complex routes along which this fabric selampur traveled. It was produced, Pedro tells me, at about 20 points along the Coromandel coast, as well as in Surat, in Gujarat, in Bengal and Ceylon. Now, from these points, it was traded out by South Asian and Dutch merchants into much of Southeast Asia and as far as Japan. Selampurs were also shipped around the Cape to Europe, where they were used for printing imitation Indian chintz, so they also came to be known as chintz cloths. So from Europe, they were then re-exported to West Africa, and from there into the transatlantic slave trade. So Pedro went and did some research for me on the Mozambican link, and he indicated that in the early 18th century, there were probably small amounts of this cloth making their way from the Coromandel coast to Mozambique. However, he said by the 19th century, this route no longer operated, and the cloth lists of the merchants that Pedro had researched did not show the word Selampur. So we are then left to speculate. Did the name linger on, and attach itself to another type of cloth? I think the question points to the difficulties that historians of cloth face, or as Pedro noted to me, part of the challenge is that cloths are often treated in overly generalized ways by historians who have not spent enough time thinking about the materiality of textiles and its particular demand logics. But now, fortunately, a new book by Pedro, which I think came out virtually yesterday or the day before, will help us with these problems. Now, whatever the real situation, these trade routes and pathways point to the diverse meanings that objects acquire as they travel. Selampur in Southern Africa, as I've said, is firmly believed to be a Portuguese word and to have come via the Portuguese. And very importantly, it also came to be associated with ethnic tradition. So that when families up in the north of South Africa converted to Christianity, their daughters disassociated themselves from what they called Selampur girls. And the dances that they performed in those skirts that we saw. So Selampur here became a sign of heathenness. Now, this traditional association of Selampur has been explored by the contemporary South African artist Samson Mudzunga. He's a sculptor and a performance artist, and he is noted for his carved drums, or also known as ngoma. And there's a wonderful example of an ngoma on the exhibition, and it reminds us of one of the themes of the exhibition is how far these Swahili forms travel, and how forms from that monsoon-created world move further south. So Mudzunga's drums frequently feature Selampur. Okay, so here you can see it's a drum that he's made, and he has these little hinged doors to the drum, and the inside of the drum is then lined with this fabric. In some cases, he creates huge coffin drums, okay? And he climbs into these drums in his performance pieces. So here you see he's climbing into the coffin. And then once inside, he changes his clothes and he re-emerges as a reborn figure. And you can see the Selampur is an important part of the whole work. So like all trade objects, Selampur has been made across many different sites and circuits so that its origins cannot be traced to one place. And in contemporary understandings, it can be both Portuguese, ethnically traditional, and part of a modernist performance installation at the same time. Okay, let's move along onto our second object, which is a shrine, this time in Singapore. And if you've been to Singapore, it's apparently quite a tourist attraction, so you might in fact have seen it. It's the grave of Habib Noor, a Sufi saint noted for his spiritual talents and his work among the poor. He was born at sea in 1788 to Yemeni parents, and he settled in Singapore as a young man. He died in 1866, and his shrine soon became a site of pilgrimage, a kramat, to use the Malay term for the graves of notable figures. As Sumit Mandal's work indicates, such shrines, quote, dot the landscape of much of Muslim Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean region as a whole. While the resident of the kramat or the shrine was generally Muslim, these sites attracted people of diverse faiths and ethnicities. In addition to being Muslim, the person commemorated in the kramat shared two further features. Many of them were Sayyids, male descendants of the Prophet, and they were Hadramis from the Hadramaut in Yemen. Okay? So this group of Hadrami Sayyids played a major role in extending Islam to Africa, to West India, and the Malay archipelago. They traveled as traders and merchants, administrators, bankers, and religious teachers, and they created pathways of mosques and schools in their wake. They married local women, often in more than one port, and integrated themselves into these communities. So as Eng Seng Ho indicates in his magnificent account of this diaspora, this book called The Graves of Tarim, he says, the breadth of the Indian Ocean from Ethiopia to Sumatra became a frontier for missionary settlement of the Hadrami Sayyids. So being diasporic, they retained a strong allegiance to Hadramaut, and as Ho indicates, they generated textual corpuses to recreate their imagined links to their homeland and their position in the line of prophetic descent. Towards this end, they generated genealogies, biographies, family histories, chronicles, pilgrimage manuals, which Ho examines as the traveling representations of a mobile people. Now, this theme of text and textuality is taken up in the exhibition, where one section is called In the Presence of Words, and explores language and writing, both Kiswahili and Arabic, as a form of Swahili aesthetic expression. It examines Swahili book illumination as a mode that expresses the sacred significance of writing as an affective and spiritual mode. Now, another scholar who's taken up these themes is Ronit Ricci in this book called Islam Translated, and where she traces the spread of the religion from South Asia into Southeast Asia through the spread of popular religious forms and genres. And she examines how these were disseminated, translated, adapted, and re-scripted across Arabic, Tamil, Javanese, and Malay. One example she considers is the Shahada, the two-sentence profession of faith: there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. She examines the power and mobility of this tiny little text and discusses an 18th century Javanese story that demonstrates its power. So let me tell you the story in her words. Entitled Serat Pandita Raib, the story is a rather fantastic retelling of the Prophet's early struggles with the people of Kebar, the oasis where a large Jewish population resided. The central figure, Pandita Raib, is a Jewish leader and teacher who persuades kings already converted to Islam to forsake their new faith and battle the Prophet's armies. One day, when Pandita Raib is about to go on a journey, a letter falls from the sky. Upon opening it and realizing that it contains the Shahada, Pandita Raib is aghast. He commands that a great fort surrounded by moats be built around the letter, barring entrance to all. However, when Pandita Raib leaves on a journey, his son Sahib is drawn irresistibly to the fort, and through divine intervention is able to enter it, finding the letter with the luminous words of the Shahada appearing magically in his hands. From that day onward, he is sick with longing for the Prophet and will not rest until he reaches and embraces Islam. The appearance of the Shahada marks a turning point that leads ultimately to Sahib's conversion. The oasis falls and Pandita Raib is killed. As Ricci notes, it is a sign of the futility of defying Islam, an object of beauty and light, and a set of words so powerful that it conquers even the most wise, strong, and cunning. The document is a form of sensory power, an agent capable of shifting circumstances in the world. It has the power to seize people and change them entirely. It is also a text that is destined to travel, and even a mighty fortress and a moat cannot keep it from circulating. Okay, so let's move on to now our third object, which is the HMS Columbine. There's no picture of the actual Columbine, but apparently it looked something like this. And the ship formed part of a British anti-slaving patrol established in the Indian Ocean after the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire in 1807. Now, the number of vessels available for this mission was, however, woefully inadequate, and at times the entire East African coast was patrolled by one ship. Even when dhows were apprehended, it was difficult to know, in fact, who was a slave, as Johann Matthews' recent book indicates. British Navy officials, influenced by the Atlantic slave trade, were invariably searching for barracoons and shackled Africans. Slaves in the Indian Ocean traveled in small numbers, and it was difficult to tell if people on dhows were crew, relations, wives, children, or slaves. Influenced by Atlantic images of slavery, British officials were searching for Africans, hence they often overlooked Baluchis or Circassians who were indeed being transported as slaves. Yet these difficulties notwithstanding, the HMS Columbine did manage to capture a number of dhows with people who had decided were slaves. And it did this in part by disseminating false reports of its destination, leaving the harbour in one direction and then went over the horizon going elsewhere. Between 1860 and 1890, the ship seized between 2,000 and 3,000 slaves from dhows and delivered them to Port Victoria in the Seychelles. And once there, they were declared to be free and were known as liberated Africans. Their fate, however, was far from being free, and they were parcelled off as indentured labourers on 5-year contracts to plantations in the Seychelles and beyond. Now, these registers, as you can see, are lists of liberated Africans landed from the HMS Columbine. These lists come to me via a poet, Yvette Christianse, who has used part of these registers in a poetry collection. Okay? And she's produced this poetry collection called Imprenda Hora. And Imprenda Hora it was the name of a slave ship, okay, that was seized by British patrols in the Indian Ocean, with those on board being declared liberated Africans before being delivered to St. Helena, okay, as indentured labourers. I'm sure you all know where St. Helena is, but there's a picture anyway. This volume is hence not only about slavery, but it's very much a volume, she's interested in the articulation of unfree labour across both the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. The poetry collection is divided into 2 sections. There's one called Atlantic and one called Indian. And she's juxtaposing or asking us to think comparatively about those 2 oceans and to relativize the Atlantic, which has long dominated understandings of slavery and has tended to obscure the Indian Ocean slave trade and its dynamics. Which very briefly, these tended to be that there were more women than men. It was more household than plantation slavery. The boundary between slave and free was more porous, and the institution of slavery was less racialized than in the Atlantic. Although, of course, the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean were not discrete, and there was plantation slavery in the Indian Ocean world. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what Yvette has done with these registers, you can see, if you look, there's a number, male or female, a name, a photograph, mother's name, and so forth and so on. And as you can see, it starts at 343, 344, etc., and she's transcribed that slave register exactly. And then what she's done is she's inserted these voices of what we assume, although it's not clear, are these liberated Africans on the ship. And as the poem progresses, these fragments of voices pick up momentum, okay, and eventually sort of, expand to sort of slightly overwhelm the register. Okay, so this interaction of different systems of servile labour in the Indian Ocean world constitutes an extremely important historical theme. European empires relied on slave, penal, and bonded labour to build much of their infrastructure. And in constructing these systems, they engineered an articulation of different systems of unfree labour to create racialized hierarchies. So, for example, in the Natal sugar plantations, Africans worked alongside South Asian indentured labourers, but Africans would at times be used to punish or flog South Asian labourers, thereby creating, these kinds of hierarchies. And of course, the whole South Asian indentured labor system came about in the wake of the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833, and resulted in millions of South Asian men and women being recruited to work on plantations in Southeast Asia, Natal, Fiji, and the Caribbean. Now, this coerced movement, whether of slaves, prisoners, indentured workers, constitutes a conscripted and coerced form of modernity in which groups from very different parts of the world were forcibly hurled together. Historian Claire Anderson has undertaken significant work on what she calls these carceral assemblages, while Amitav Ghosh's famous novel Sea of Poppies has fictionalized these experiences, putting together characters sentenced to penal transportation and indentured laborers on one ship. Now, I think this conscripted modernity leads us to our second last item, which is one of the world's more famous books, Gandhi's Hind Swaraj. And you can see here, this is its first English translation, although subsequent English editions came to be known as Hind Swaraj rather than Indian Home Rule. Now, it's a manifesto of sorts. The text is directed against those in the Indian anti-colonial movement who favoured violent forms of resistance. Gandhi regarded this strategy as reproducing the logic of imperialism itself, as wanting, quote, English rule without the Englishman. You want the tiger's nature, but not the tiger. The text also weighs in against the political uses of vast abstractions like nation and freedom, and is skeptical of grand schemes in which freedom can be claimed on behalf of others. So in a very famous quote, he says, "What others get for me is not home rule." Everyone has to claim their own freedom by learning to rule themselves or to exercise self-rule. Now, the book itself was written in Gujarati at sea as Gandhi returned from London to Southern Africa in late 1909, and it came to him famously in one great rush, with him turning to use his left hand when his right hand was too tired. So early in 1910, the Gujarati text appeared, first in Gandhi's newspaper, Indian Opinion, and then as a book. And the English translation, and you see it here, was printed later that year on Gandhi's first ashram just north of Durban. And virtually everybody on that ashram, and here you see a picture of them, was involved in some aspect of its production. So Durban was a colonial port city shaped by the Indian Ocean currents and diasporas. And like other port cities around the Indian Ocean, it both produced and received printed matter, part of the blizzard of periodicals, pamphlets, leaflets, tracts, and newspapers that wafted around the Indian Ocean. This print formed part of the communications infrastructure of empire, and as Mark Rovan de Frost has shown, anti-colonial elites in these port cities utilized these opportunities to share ideas, personnel, publications, and technology, turning the Indian Ocean literal into a kind of quoting circle as activists and intellectuals used each other's strategies and insights. Many of the visions and schemes emanating from these port city intellectuals were ambitious and were intended to draw together people in transoceanic formations that could dislodge or at least subversively inhabit the power of empire. And some of these grand schemes, which we've touched on earlier, included Hindu reformism, theosophy, pan-Islam, pan-Buddhism, Sikh transnationalism, African nationalism, and also the idea of imperial citizenship, that everybody should have equal rights under empire. Now, Gandhi's ideas in Hind Swaraj emerged from these diasporic dynamics, and where in Durban, Gandhi encountered a motley collection of different South Asian communities thrown together through these mobility, these patterns of mobility and forced circulation in the Indian Ocean. As many have pointed out, the juxtaposition of these different communities in South Africa constituted a kind of miniature India and allowed Gandhi to grasp India in a way that was not possible on the vast, sprawling subcontinent itself. Yet the difficulties of trying to forge a polyglot, polyreligious, polycaste nation out of a set of determinately sectional units were not inconsiderable. One response on Gandhi's part was to radically recast the idea of nation and sovereignty itself. What if a nation was less an abstract cloak thrown over a congeries of people and was more an ideal that had to be fostered from the ground up, one person at a time? One important method for realizing the self-rule in individuals was satyagraha, non-cooperation or passive resistance, which Gandhi first trialed in South Africa and then exported to India to such good effect. So Gandhi, of course, is one of the figures that has dominated the 20th century, and I think one important point, I suppose, that I'm making here is that his thinking was crucially shaped by the intellectual currents and movements of the Indian Ocean world. Okay, let's move then onto the final lap and our last object for this evening, which is a jellyfish. And the idea to focus on this particular creature was in part prompted by reports in 2015 of Indian Ocean jellyfish invading the Mediterranean. And apparently this had been caused, the Suez Canal had been widened, the density of salinity in the water had weakened, allowing jellyfish to migrate from one ocean to another. Now, the symbolic weight of these reports is, of course, striking, with the jellyfish being seen as a kind of insurgent force, perhaps appropriately enough, since the Indian Ocean has often been described as the third world ocean or the subaltern sea. Now, while this theme is important, the jellyfish themselves also point us, I think, in a slightly different direction, that of thinking below the waterline, of thinking about the sea as sea, and to think about the depths and materiality of the ocean rather than simply looking at the surface. So oceanic studies has taught us a lot about the people, objects, and ideas that traverse the surfaces of the oceans. This work has tended to be human-centered and concerned largely with the ocean as a backdrop. The rise of ocean levels, a tangible sign of climate change in the Anthropocene, has however precipitated a new awareness of the ocean, inaugurating a new critical ocean studies which directs our attention downwards, below the waterline, asking us to engage with both human and non-human aspects of the sea, with the depth and the surface. These intellectual developments, I think, open up really interesting vistas for humanities scholars. So changing ideas of the ocean demand a radical interdisciplinarity where, for example, literary studies must engage with oceanographers and vice versa. This is, of course, an area where a lot of people are doing a lot of really interesting and exciting work. And let me just talk briefly about one example from Stacey Alimo in her influential piece called Jellyfish Science, Jellyfish Aesthetics. Now, as she just indicates, jellyfish is, of course, a misleading term covering several different categories, but let's just stick with jellyfish for the moment. So she begins by pointing out a contradiction. She says, on the one hand, jellyfish are a source of environmental panic. So as oceanic acidification allows their population to expand dramatically, they come to be known as the cockroaches of the sea. But on the other hand, jellyfish have become objects of aesthetic pleasure, apparent in the jewel-like photographs of jellyfish, one of which was used for the poster for this evening. Yet, of course, there's a further contradiction that these sorts of images are largely consumerized and extract jellyfish from the complexities of their environment. There's a further complicating dimension, and that is the fact that while jellyfish can look gorgeous, it is difficult to identify with them. A jellyfish has no nose, it has apparently no tongue or no eyes, and as Alimo indicates, it does not provoke a sense of interspecies solidarity as a polar bear marooned on a small piece of ice might. Yet in their inscrutability, jellies remind us of the limits of human understanding since we know so little about them. They erode our claims to sovereign knowledge and modes of being. Quoting a scientist who works on jellyfish, she notes, "Perhaps it is not enough to simply think our way through the world. More important, how do we sense it or absorb it. In short, Jellyfish invite us to reconsider the boundaries between nature, art, and science, and to move towards what she calls a post-humanist humility. Now, the question, of course, of how we will integrate a material engagement with the Indian Ocean and its submarine inhabitants with existing oceanic studies have, I think, only started to unfold. They will certainly add further complexity to a rich history of scholarship on this multifarious ocean. And to close, let me take a quote from Antoinette Burton's work on the Indian Ocean. And she provides this wonderful summation of the meanings of the Indian Ocean. Maritime complex, infinite horizon, interregional arena, floating cosmopolis, Afrasian sea, poet's muse, linguistic caravan, coastal zone, superpower battleground, bookseller's highway, aquatic maelstrom, indentured passageway, civilizational basin, trade circuit, pilgrim path, monsoon corridor, seafarer's route, mobile marketplace, province of pirates, and burial ground. Thank you very much.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Africans on the continent as producers or originators of certain or of Indian Ocean histories. I struggle with this when I see the Indian Ocean historiography as it stands now, where there is an overwhelming amount of proportional dissimilarity to origins on the other side of the sea, that is India. And what I do not find, or struggle to find, are stories originating on the African continent. And that leads me to second order sort of question, where I'm wondering to what degree does scale shape how we see the Indian Ocean? In terms of, in practical terms, are Indian Ocean histories largely histories of port cities? How inland do they go? And I'm thinking, how much more inland do they go, particularly on the African side, I think? And I was also, this question came to me when you were talking about the artist, the performance artist, using the drum. And I was reminded of Terence Ranger and Phyllis Martin and all of their work on East Africa, where the Ngoma drum is used in Beni societies, and Beni societies on the Swahili coast are extremely, often quite rigidly classified internally between inland sort of tribal Africans with their backward forms of music and Zanzibari, more coastal, more cosmopolitan Africans also with more Islamic influences. So there I see friction. There I see, it's coastal but more inland, and yet there is friction, and I see more African participation in a history as opposed to a frame as it stands in the historiography now. So I'm wondering if in a sort of long-winded way, how we place scale Africans as originators or more rooted in Africa sort of stories that come out of there, and how the two can kind of play out in this historiographical frame.
Okay. So thank you. A series of responses. I think partly the question, the one way to think about it is the question that this exhibition raises of where does Africa and Asia begin and end? Okay? So one often thinks, for example, if you're thinking about what is the sort of maritime activity in the monsoon world, then I think it's also difficult to say, okay, this person would definitely be African and this person wouldn't. Okay, so partly because it's been such a world of such layered interaction. Okay, I think maybe also the category of Africa itself has to be brought into question, and I think very much that's partly what this exhibition does. Okay? I think, as I understand your question, you're also asking about the extroversions of Africa into the Indian Ocean world. Okay? So those are, I mean, there's medieval and early modern movements of slaves and scholars and administrators and all of those sorts of things who end up as cities, city communities in India. So if you work in African studies, a lot of that is available. There's a lot of work on particularly African slave trades around Madagascar and the Mascarenes. So there would be a lot of stuff about, that you could, if you were interested in scale and numbers of people moving. There's also, I think, a lot of work starting to be done on African sailors. But again, it would be very difficult, I think, to say, and perhaps slightly pointless often to say, I will go and decide this Lascar is African and this one isn't. So I think maritime history would be another area that one could look at. There's quite interesting work being done on the Southeast African coast, and numbers of African sailors being seen as kind of picaresque adventurers, sort of reinventing themselves through maritime activity. There's also a lot of work now being done on African travelers and travelogues in the Indian Ocean world. There's also interesting work on, for example, political exiles, African political exiles in India is another. A lot, obviously, African soccer players in India is another group that is quite prominent and well known. So I think that in all of these different sites, and obviously, if you inhabit African studies, then there's huge amounts of very rich work looking, at all sorts of complex interactions. So Jim Brennan's work, for example, is raises a lot of those questions in relation to Tanzania. So I suppose it's an interesting thing. There's a lot of stuff there, but I suppose it's just never been somehow. Going back to Chowdhury's work, where somehow, South Asia became the centre of the Indian Ocean imaginary. And it's been surprisingly hard to unseat that.
I have a much less intellectual question than Potential. It's about the word Salem. Allison, isn't there something from your exhibit
Yes,
from Salem?
I thought that's where it was going to go, but it clearly didn't.
Yes. And so is the word in the cloth that you showed us, is the part of Salem 4 not a reference to a North American Salem?
I've got absolutely no idea. If Pedro were here, he could help us. But, I've never really thought about it that way. I had thought that it was just the term that had arisen on the Coromandel coast. And but thank you. I'll certainly go and think
Now,
more about it.
Allison, what do you think? What do you think?
I would also have to defer to Pedro on that because I don't know the history well enough. But it's probably unlikely because the kinds of materials that were coming out of Salem were actually a very, very simple white cloth of Americani, which is actually really Swahili term for America that to indicate its origins. But it was a white broadcloth that was coming from the United States into Eastern Africa. A whole different sort of direction. Instead of the cloth coming out of India, in fact, there was a competition between the Americani and a lot of the South Asian cloths that were coming out of Gujarat. So I think whether or not, and those were not called, there was no sort of nominal connection with Salem as a place. So I don't know, but of course it was the first thing I thought of when I thought about where the story was going to go, but in fact it didn't. So that's really interesting. But I think that's why I think it's probably not, but we would defer to the figure for sure. Yes?
I wonder if you could elaborate a bit about some issues that arose out of the story of the Sufi saint. So, in a lot of different settings, there's often a very small ethnic religious minority who disproportionately do a lot of stuff and connect people together across places, like, the Jewish communities, like in England, the Industrial Revolution, the Levant, so I'm curious about how that played out. And you mentioned cosmopolitanism, for example, the right, moving around in different places, but often we find cosmopolitanism weird. As a foreigner, I'm invariably asked where are you from. People want to know where you are from. You have to be from a place. And it just struck me in your story of the Sufi thing. On ship, so you kind of, you're not from any land. So, I can elaborate
on that. I think it's a really interesting thing, because I think that question of where are you from is arguably a product of the British Empire. Because it was really, it was the whole kind of racial bureaucracy of empire tended to produce those sorts of questions of provenance. The Eng Seng Ho's work is really interesting on this, and what he argues is that these Hadramis are both diasporic, but they very much integrate themselves into local communities, and which is an interesting thing to maintain. So a lot of this production of the textual material that they produce is to keep that link open. But very often in diasporic communities, there's a sense that you sequester yourself from the society in which you arrive, in order to keep your. But the Hadramis seem to kind of manage to kind of straddle this boundary and to be both integrate themselves into the places where they landed, but also keep. So I think it's probably also, I would say, maybe just, to think about it in sort of pre-British Empire and post-British Empire terms.
I'm going to go back to that Salem Board thing because it's an interesting thing. I've always seen it in writing. This was the very first time I heard somebody pronounce it, Salem Board. And whenever I saw it in writing, I thought it was Salem Board. And because it's coming from the Persian-Arabic word of healthy, strong, and poor, very Persian word, offspring. So I always thought that's the connection, and actually that's sort of an interesting sort of intrigue there to bring back in what we were talking earlier about the boundaries and how we draw these boundaries, and we bring in that kind of Persian-Arabic roots to the word. Perhaps that would also help to map another geography for this. I might be totally wrong, but it was an interesting kind of misinterpretation on my part, perhaps, because I've never heard Salem. I read it Salem. So I don't know. Maybe that would take you to another direction altogether.
But it's wonderful as part of this, returning to the exhibition, the sense of that you can't really, ultimately know or ascribe something that's coming from one place. And so it's a wonderful, this conversation is really interesting because I was thinking in the Southern African context, Terry was thinking of Salem here, and you were thinking really of the sort of Persian world. So it's and probably all of those have some bearing on the topic.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. I don't want to be the dead horse. I was going to add one more thing to the Salem Board conversation. And trying to coordinate Terry and Tatia's sort of observations. I mean, my first thought was Jeremy Prestholt's Domesticating the World and the sort of circulation of Americani cloth, but also he makes the point of the sort of African taste for cloth intervening more broadly in markets, Indian Ocean markets that connect. So I just thought that, I mean, maybe, I don't know, it's worth mentioning. But my actual question has nothing to do with that, thankfully. I was really sort of struck by the sort of irreconcilability between the sort of human form of the jellyfish and the broader question of the materiality of the sea itself. And I'm wondering, I don't know if this is just talk about this a little bit, but like how, you know, thinking about the sea itself, the jellyfish, sort of microbes, et cetera, how can we even fold that into the existing sort of thematic touch points in its geography of the Indian Ocean world, of cosmopolitanism, of empire, of nationalism, of third worldism. There seems to be a sort of gap that I can't think through.
Thank you. I think it's really, you've sort of hit the nail on the head there, because partly you need to keep your eye on the surface, because if you're interested in broadly in questions of sort of social justice and history, then, you know, because a lot of the stories of the surface are stories of slavery and indenture, and so you've got to keep that within your focus, okay? But so it's this really interesting question of how do you keep your eye both on the water and below the water level. And it's something just a group of us in Johannesburg have started to grapple with this. So what we did was we signed up for an oceanography course, partly just also to equip oneself with a vocabulary for thinking about different kinds of water, you know, temperature, salinity, pressure, current, wind, all of those sorts of things. So partly just also to get a vocabulary and to start somehow thinking about these things. We've also started just as an experiment to run conversations, because if you're going to have an interdisciplinary thing, often the best way just to do it is to get the conversation going and see what comes out of it. So we ran an event called Sound on Water, which had a musician, a musicologist, an engineer, and a social scientist. And that was really interesting to see what came out of that. There is, of course, I mean, partly, of course, there is a lot of work that has a strong environmental concern. So there's Marcus Rediker's work on the shark and the slave ships. John Thornton has done work on current and wind in the slave trade. There's very interesting work emerging, that I'm aware of because I'm in literature, thinking about how to read literary texts for the sea as an actant. There's also a lot of interesting work thinking about coastal form, amphibian aesthetics. So those sorts of, so I think there's sort of, you know, there seem to be a lot of interesting initiatives in different directions.
Thank you.
I think it's really hard, you know. I mean, I'm very much grappling with it, and I find it really difficult.
Maybe it's a bit naive. So much of world history has really been history across land and empires, such as the Silk Road and so on. Here we have an example of a maritime Silk Road which unites. And another way of conceiving of history is to conceive of large bodies of water, oceans not as separated but as uniform. The Mediterranean is one such body of water which united European and North Atlantic Ocean in one unit, and the Indian Ocean going over into maritime routes through Indonesia and up the coast of China is another way to conceive of the unity of history and transmission of culture and theme. And the Atlantic is also can be seen as not as a divider, as a place where the ocean transmits, and now the Pacific is being seen as a sort of unified.
And I think it's a really interesting question because partly, this idea of the question is often asked, why do you want to study the Indian Ocean? Why do you want to study the Atlantic? And increasingly, there's a sense of there's so many interactions and intersections between all of these that maybe we should just think about the world ocean. So that is one position. Some people say, well, if you want to hang on to these categories of Indian Ocean or Atlantic, it's a kind of area studies at sea. So, Africa was an area, South Asia was an area. Now the Indian Ocean's become simply a maritime area. So I think, they're very, but they're both very good reasons for wanting to keep those categories and very good reasons for wanting to also, deconstruct them in some ways. But I think the interesting thing is that if you look at the scholarship, the Mediterranean became a very great model that people often then wanted to reproduce. So when scholarship on the Indian Ocean really started, it was people wanted almost to reproduce the scholarship that had happened on the Mediterranean, and there was this huge search for let's find the things that unify, let's treat the Indian Ocean as a system. And then there are a lot of people who say, well, that's really perhaps not the most productive way to proceed. In fact, because certainly there's cosmopolitanism in the Indian Ocean, but there's equally as well, huge division, huge parochialism, all of those sorts of things.
We're talking about how the Indian Ocean sort of exchanges and networks of the Indian Ocean tend to give to proliferation of universalisms, whether it be Muslim and Islamism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more to what is it about this transitional experience that tends to have this sort of tendency towards creating these universalisms. Why those kind of universal narratives, especially like somebody who just think how there are so many, nationalistic and cultural institutions who are intentionally keeping the outward and the multiple regions, but having it being very placed. So is this move towards ideology having universal sort of contours to it? What is going on there? It's not a matter of just connecting nodes, and there must be more than that. So I was wondering if you speak so much better.
I suppose it is, the one argument would be that it's a response to imperialism and that it's a response to Protestantism. Because Protestantism establishes itself as this idea of this is what a religion is supposed to look like, and you've got to package it in this way, and you've got to have these grand claims, and you've got to have texts and all the rest of it. So that's the one argument that's often made, that, say, Hindu reformism, through organizations like the Arya Samaj, start to model themselves as a kind of Hindu Protestantism. So I think that's the one argument. And the other one is, of course, that it has a sort of anti-imperial impetus, that you're trying to trump another grand scheme, causing some people to say, well, why do you want to, why do we want to look at that actually? Are we not now more interested in those who said, no grand schemes for me? So I think it is partly, although some people might say that versions of Islam pre-empire did have certain universal aspirations.
I was just thinking about people's respect and fear of oceans, and I don't actually know that much about the Indian Ocean. As somebody once told me that you could tell a Midwesterner if they knew all the verses to the song about the Edmund Fitzgerald, which is all about a tanker that sank on the Great Lakes. And I'm wondering if you don't know all of the verses, you're not a Midwesterner, so there's that. But I was just wondering about art. We always talk about the Indian Ocean as kind of a highway and people skipping around the edges of it. Are there parts of it where no one wants to go?
It's a very interesting, the parts that where nobody initially wanted to go were the parts below the monsoon, okay? Because the monsoon meant that it was it wasn't easy, but it was relatively easy to cross. And so the area sort of just below northern Mozambique, where the monsoon stops, was considered to be completely wild and uncivilized by Muslim navigators. So that was, and then also, of course, the lower down you get then into that wild Southern Ocean, and so also, of course, the sea around the Cape. And it's one argument that there was no sort of pre-colonial Southern African maritime exploration because the sea was just very difficult. But I do think that question also about the whole question, sort of attitudes towards the sea are really interesting. And you get, if you think around the coast of Africa, you get in East Africa the idea of gyms that are often associated with the ocean. In parts of Southern Africa, you get this sense. People, sometimes in KwaZulu-Natal, for example, you hear people say, we have nothing to do with the ocean because it belongs to the ancestors. So it's also that realm. And then you go around the corner and then you're into the realm of Mami Wata. So it's a very interesting kind of, that sort of mapping.
Yeah. As I'm listening to your presentation, which just makes it sound like you inhale and out comes these observations. It's very fluid, but you're citing lots of other authors and attributing units of your talk to them. And I'm wondering if this is the kind of work that can only be done as a collaboration. Because to study Morocco, you learn your Arabic, and you learn your geography, and everything in those borders is Moroccan, and it's kind of easy, right? Every now and then someone leaps across to Spain. But the minute you start studying a water body, there are 18 different languages. There are, these mobilities where we don't even know, as you said, whether someone is, what they are, what category, what box we put them in, those normal categories. So this is a kind of almost a methodological question. Can you talk about that? Because here you are taking oceanography, so now you're definitely working collaboratively with people in the jellyfish world.
Yeah. I suppose, it's a really fascinating question, and it's the problem that we all grapple with, and it's presented to us by global histories and world histories and those large-scale forms of analysis that we all now, that we do. I was trained originally in African studies, and my first book was this micro study of a little village up in the north of South Africa. And I can't tell you how I missed that, because you could read all the archival work on it, you could, it was, and from there I had to sort of kind of launch myself up into the world, and I often have the sense of sort of intellectual vertigo. But I think it's at the same time it's a really fascinating and interesting methodological challenge about how you do that. And I do think there are really interesting collaborative projects that have sprung up. And just to say, a really interesting one was a Kai Kresser who worked on the Swahili coast, and Edward Simpson, who was an anthropologist of Gujarat, got together and they changed sites. So Ed went to the Swahili coast and Kai went to Gujarat. So those, and I suppose you just have to keep trying and exploring things and see what happens, and long desperately for that little micro history that we used to do.
A final question. Do you have a favorite object in the exhibition?
Oh, do I have a favorite object in the exhibition? Oh, they were all so fantastic. think it was the shoes.
Good.